I'm a member of staff, a member of academic staff here in the University of Dundee. I've been here since 1989, and the reason I've stayed here is that I think it's a fantastic place to be. I really love being in Scotland. I really love the city of Dundee, and psychology has been a fantastic home for me since 1989. So I'm going to say a little bit about what psychology is. And there are all sorts of images of psychology, popular images, some of which are quite misleading. So very often, I think the general assumption about psychology and psychologists, whenever you mention that, people typically think of Sigmund Freud, a very influential figure, well known for his work, a Freudian theorist. The whole discipline was named after him. And he was interested very much in the unconscious, and he developed a particular way of investigating the individual's psychological functioning. And it involved, as is well known, the interpretation of dreams. So, as I said, people very often think, oh yeah, psychology, that's all Freudian theory, and that a lot of it is going to be based upon learning of Freud's theories and of his various co-workers. However, the reality actually is very, very different. The reality is that psychology is immensely broad. We're trying to explain human behaviour, and in order to understand human behaviour, you need to look at that behaviour from a whole variety of different perspectives, different levels of analysis. We need to know something about the biology of the brain, the physical structure of the brain, the various areas, how they relate to each other, how they, in a sense, speak to each other, how they, if you are subject to brain injury, how different areas of the brain will be differentially affected. We need to have some understanding of cognitive psychology. How are we able to represent the world? How are we able to store information, to process information, to manipulate information? We need to understand something about our ability as humans to communicate and to use language. Language is an amazing skill. What you're looking at now are squiggles on a screen, yet somehow, because you've learned to read, you can understand. There is a sense in which you're able to work out what I am intending to communicate. That is an amazing accomplishment, to be able to read, to transform squiggles on a screen into words and meaning and understanding. We need to understand how we differ. We all differ from each other in a million different ways. So to study our individual differences in terms of our personality, in terms of our abilities, in terms of a whole variety of factors. We need to understand how we develop. We develop over the lifespan. Those first few years of life, you see massive developmental changes. Any of you with a child, any of you with siblings younger than yourselves, you will have seen an individual go through massive developmental stages. Trying to understand that. What are those processes of how do individuals develop? And of course, the developmental trajectory that people go down is varied. So we have typical and atypical forms of development. Another area of psychology is clinical psychology. We're interested in people's experience, and we're interested in the full range of those experiences. Many of those experiences will unfortunately be experiences of distress. So we're very interested in terms of trying to understand the basis for people's experience of mental ill health. We're also interested in how all of these processes are affected by the social context that we're in. We aren't individuals isolated from each other. We are connected with each other in all sorts of ways. So I'm a social psychologist, and I'm interested in how our sense of who we are is bound up with the group memberships that we belong to, and how that shapes our functioning, our health and well-being, and so on. So hopefully you have a sense that the reality is rather different from the image. It is much broader. It really is very wide-ranging. And one of the big features of that breadth is that I can guarantee there is something there that will fascinate you. You may not be fascinated by all of these different features of psychology, but there is something here for everybody. I can guarantee that. And we're trying to have these different levels of analysis to develop that understanding of the individual. We are an empirical discipline. Freud was able to sit in his armchair and establish various theories. Establishing theories is one thing, but being able to really robustly interrogate those theories and see to what degree do they hold water, to what degree are they able to explain what is in front of us. That is a real skill. So psychology is very much an empirical discipline, the scientific study of mind and behaviour, and we gather empirical data from other people. And we want to be able to describe those data very carefully. We want to be able to explain them. We want to develop theories, and we want to use those theories to predict people's behaviour. A really good theory will allow you to make predictions. And we want also very often to try to influence people's behaviour. So if you think of the current pandemic, there's been quite a lot of psychology in the media as we talk about how to shape people's behaviour so that they are less likely to be in a position where they transmit the virus from one to the other. So it's an empirical discipline, and we have a whole variety of research methods at our disposal. This may involve putting a cap on somebody's skull with electrodes and measuring the brain activity inside the skull, as here. It may involve using a device like this, where we are able to track your eye movements. So when you are reading a piece of text, we can see where you are looking, or where you are looking at a visual scene, we can see what areas of that scene you pay attention to. We're able to use these devices to work out where you are focusing your attention. And it also involves field research. So this picture of a tent is a picture of the experimental headquarters that we had for a project that I was involved in India, where we were looking at pilgrims attending a massive Hindu pilgrimage festival on the banks of the Ganga. And in here, we would meet each day, we would organise our research team, and we would bring in participants to take part in our research. So we do research in a variety of ways in all manner of different contexts. Now, psychology is, as I said, broad. If you think about the biological basis for behaviour, we need to understand, as I said before, the brain and how it's organised. And the various methods we can use to investigate that are diverse. Perhaps the most obvious is to look at brain injury. And the picture there of that man was taken in 1848. He was a railway worker, and in a dreadful accident, an iron rod that he's holding went through his skull. He survived, his eyesight was damaged, but he survived, he was able to talk, but there were all sorts of psychological changes, as you would expect from such a traumatic injury. So we can investigate what happens to people when particular areas of the brain are damaged rather than others. We're also, as I said, able to use a device where we put a cap on somebody's skull and measure brain activity. And we're gradually building up a map of what the brain looks like, the various areas of the brain, what they are responsible for, how they relate with each other. So a good psychology degree will include biological psychology. We're also interested, as I mentioned, in how we process information, and we have a whole variety of routines that help us to process information, and overcoming those routines can be very, very hard. So there is a test called the Stroop test, and in this you will read words that relate to colours, but rather than reading out the word itself, you have to say the colour of the font in which it's printed. So normally, if I had to read out that first column of words and simply say what the word says, it would be very easy. Pink, red, orange, green, yellow, red. I can do that very quickly. Now I have to read the same words, but this time not say the word that I actually see, rather say the colour of the font used in writing that word. So that would mean I'd have to say blue, green, blue, red, green, blue. That's quite harder. You're having to overcome the routine way of processing information. And sometimes that task will be really hard. If you have been awake for 24 hours, then I can guarantee your performance on that task will be much slower than if you were fresh out of bed in the morning. So we can use that as a measure of your capacity to process information in a new and rather different manner. Developmental psychologists are trying to work out how we develop over time, and they have to be amazingly creative. It's very hard to study babies and children. When they're a little toddler, perhaps a year old, 2 years old, it's very hard to talk with them and to be able to ask them questions. So you have to think of creative ways of investigating some of the psychological processes that you're interested in. So, for example, if you want to investigate at what age can a baby perceive depth, you have to be creative. And one of the solutions was to come up with what they call the visual cliff. And you have a little picture of that. There you have the caregiver, in this case a mother, and you have this apparatus with a baby, and you put the baby on the surface, and then the mother is at the other end calling the baby to crawl towards her. And there is actually a sheet of glass that means that the baby would not fall over the edge of that cliff, but it looks like there is a cliff. So we're interested in, will the baby stop when they get to the edge? Will they, the mother's calling them, will they carry on or will they stop? If they stop, we have some sense that they have the ability to perceive depth and that they believe that they would fall over the edge if they continued. We can also ask, at what age can a child imagine the world from the viewpoint of another person? That's a really important skill to be able to see the world from the vantage point of a different person, to appreciate their perspective. And you can do that in a variety of ways. A very simple way is something called the 3 mountains task, and that is drawn there. What you have is a table with 3 little mountains on it, and you have a child, and you walk the child around that table 2 or 3 times, and then you bring up a little stool and you put a doll on the stool and you say, okay, can you tell me please what the doll can see? And you would show that child then a variety of pictures from different angles of those 3 mountains. At the age of 4, the child won't be able to do it. They will select a picture that corresponds to the vantage point that they themselves have right now. They won't be able to decenter and see the mountains from a different perspective. It's not until the age of 7 that children will routinely get that task right, that they will be able to select the photograph that does indeed correspond to what the doll could see. So it's an interesting way of trying to investigate the age at which children can develop certain skills. I'm a social psychologist, so I'm interested, as I hinted, about how our sense of who we are is bound up with group memberships. How does that impact the way in which we think and behave? How does it impact our likelihood of helping other people? How does it result in negative intergroup relations? Sadly, the world is full of examples of conflict between groups. That's an area where social psychologists have something to say. How is our psychological functioning shaped by our membership of various groups? So I've given you a bit of a sense as to the reality of psychology, that it's broad, that it is an empirical discipline. We're interested in doing research. We train our students in terms of the theories that are currently available and the basis for those theories in research. And we get our students to be critical consumers of research. We don't want our students to simply think, oh yes, this person is claiming this, they must be right. We want them to read research and think critically about it. So their undergraduate program has all of the elements I've described: biological, developmental, cognitive psychology, personality, clinical psychology, the psychology of language and social psychology. You would learn theories and the research that is relevant for those theories in lectures and in workshops. And then you would also develop your research skills. So being a psychologist involves being able to think critically about research and also to be able to design research and do research. So we try to develop in our students research skills, and that involves teaching various research methods, and it involves getting students to think critically about the research they read. And our students also do a dissertation in their final year. And that is something that students typically really enjoy, because it's an opportunity where they can bring together all of what they have learned over the previous years. In the first year, they're reading about other people's research, In the final year, they're doing their own research. And that really is a massive step in terms of the skills that you've developed. The degree is a 4-year degree. Entry to the second year is possible. Your degree classification actually depends upon your 3rd and 4th year performance. So the first 2 years really are an opportunity for you to explore a range of different areas and to get your confidence ready for the 3rd and 4th year. You will be taught in a variety of formats, lectures, tutorials and practicals. Lectures would be essentially the vehicle for communicating the theories in, for example, social psychology, the research, the evidence for those theories, the debates, the controversies, the disputes, because psychology, like all academic disciplines, is full of debate and dispute, which makes it exciting and interesting. So you'd have lectures. You'd also have tutorials. The tutorials are bound up with giving you that smaller scale teaching, allows you the opportunity to ask questions, allows you the opportunity to engage in discussion with your fellow students, prepare for essays, things like that. You'd also take part in practicals. And as I've said, and I've tried to emphasize, we are an empirical discipline. So to begin with, you would take part in practicals where perhaps you would take part in an experiment, and then you would get to understand the whole process of doing research. And gradually, as you move through the degree, it becomes a little bit more complicated until at the end, as I said, you do a dissertation, and that is where you would sit with a member of staff. You would identify a question that's worth asking. You would be given guidance about that. You would then think, okay, if this is the question, what's the best way of approaching it? What data could I gather that would speak to this question? What's the best sort of data? Research is always a compromise. Getting good quality data is always incredibly difficult. There's always a compromise to be made, so you'll have to discuss that. What's the best sort of data? What's the available data? How then am I going to interpret these data? How am I going to draw conclusions from them that are reasonable, that are defensible? Those are tremendous skills to get. And in the dissertation, that's really when you bring all of the skills that you've developed together in this one large piece of work. You are examined through a mixture of exams and through coursework. And as I said, it is the marks that you get in the 3rd year and the 4th year that count towards your degree. The degree we have is recognised by the British Psychological Society. Now, that's important. The British Psychological Society, the BPS, is the professional body for psychology, and they accredit university degrees. They visit every perhaps 6 or 7 years. They review the curriculum. They meet current students. They meet members of staff. They review the curriculum, the way it's delivered. They give advice and guidance about how things can be improved. So we had our accreditation visit, I think, 2 years ago, and I'm delighted to say that we are formally accredited by the BPS. So that's our undergraduate program. That's what you could expect to see. In the first couple of years, as I've already hinted, you do a variety of subjects. So typically, in the first couple of years, you do 6 modules per year. 2 of those are in psychology and 4 will be in other disciplines. So this gives you breadth. The first couple of years, it gives you breadth. It also gives you flexibility. So you may think, oh, well, I'll do 2 modules in psychology, 2 in economics and 2 in geography, say, just for example. And then after perhaps just a semester, you realize, actually, I hate history or I hate geography, whatever. That's not a problem. It means that you can change modules for the next semester. So you have tremendous flexibility. Many of our students try to learn a language. They take a module to improve their language, or perhaps to start learning a language. So in the first couple of years, as I said, you'll be doing 1/3 of your time in psychology, 2/3 in other subjects. Sometimes those subjects could be connected to psychology in some way. Traditionally, philosophy has been quite closely connected with psychology, so quite a few of our students would choose to do philosophy, but that is very much a personal choice. So it's quite a long list, quite a long menu that you have choice to pick up those modules. And as I said, the great thing is that it gives you breadth, but it also gives you that flexibility. Okay, so topics in the first year. If you were studying psychology in the first year, in semester 1, it's before Christmas, we have 2 semesters, one before Christmas, one after. This is in the first year. You could expect this introduction to psychology. You would be getting a few lectures on each of the areas of psychology that I've described. It's really to give you a taster, to give you a flavour. So I would teach 3 lectures in social psychology. A colleague of mine will give 3 lectures in developmental psychology, and so on. So it's a good way to try to convey the breadth to the discipline. In the second semester, we choose 3 areas and we focus attention on those. So again, if you were to continue into the second semester, you would have 6 lectures on social psychology, I think 6 lectures or perhaps 10 lectures on cognitive psychology, perhaps a few more, I can't remember exactly, and then some classes around research methods. So again, the very first semester designed to give you that breadth. The second semester, we take a few areas and we go into them in more depth. Cognitive psychology, sometimes people get a bit confused. What does that refer to? It is essentially the psychology of attention, learning, memory. How are we able to process information? Research methods, we introduce students to statistics, of how to design a study, of how you could measure people's performance in particular tasks, and then draw inferences about the psychological processes involved. That's the first year. The second year is going to be rather similar in that it is modelled on that semester 2 style of teaching. We will take other areas, for example, developmental psychology or biological psychology, and cover them in more depth. So really by the end of the second year, you will have had 2 years. In each year, a third of your time in psychology, you will have a broad understanding of the discipline. And then at the end of that year, you make the crucial decision. That decision is, do I carry on with psychology and proceed to graduate with a psychology degree? Do I do a joint psychology degree, perhaps psychology and another subject, psychology and economics, just for example? So you can choose to do a joint degree, or you could say, well, actually, I've enjoyed my psychology years 1 and 2, but to be honest, I've discovered I've got a passion for another subject and I would like to switch. And that should also be possible. So again, tremendous flexibility. And that flexibility really does come with the 4-year degree. It is a massive benefit, I think. If you were to choose to do psychology in your 3rd year, you'd go in and again, you would have 2 semesters, one before Christmas, one after Christmas, and you would have 4 modules before Christmas and 4 after. These labels by now should be fairly familiar. Again, we're going to be getting quite deeply into these subdisciplines of psychology in the 3rd year. This is where we cover really the core curriculum that the British Psychological Society requires. And you'll see that in both semester 1 and semester 2, we teach research skills. I teach qualitative research methods. So I run sessions on how to analyse interviews, of how to conduct focus groups, how to analyse qualitative data. Qualitative data are simply data that are non-numeric. So if you interview somebody, you have their words. How do you analyse material like that? So we teach that in the 3rd year, 2 semesters, and we cover that broad curriculum. Then you go into the 4th year, and here really you have covered the core curriculum of the British Psychological Society. Then in the 4th year you get choice. For the first time really, you get choice, and you get quite a lot of choice. So these are the sorts of modules that you could expect to see on the menu, and you would choose 3 of them. Not all of these modules will be running in any one year. The modules reflect the research interests of members of staff. So I used to do one on minorities and majorities. I'm a social psychologist interested in things to do with inequality, with homophobia, with racism, issues like that. So I used to do a 4th year course on minorities and majorities, intergroup relations. I'm not teaching one this year, but my colleagues are putting on various modules, and this gives you some sense of the research interests of members of staff. Infant development speaks for itself, I think. Reading development and disability. The ability to read is one of the key skills that a youngster develops, and we develop those skills in different ways to different levels, and it can have enormous impact upon an individual's life chances and their mental health and mental well-being. So big issues around literacy, inequality. So how can we understand the development of reading? How could we try to intervene to improve some people's reading ability? We have people interested in decision making, second language processing. I actually only speak one language, I'm ashamed to admit. I had a little bit of French at school, but very, very little. However, my wife has 2 languages. English is her second language, and she is able to move between these 2 languages with great skill. What's going on there? How is that possible? We have people interested in mental health, of course, and the bottom one there on the left, Society, Mind and Health, that's run by a social psychologist interested in the social basis for our mental well-being. So a variety of modules bound up with the research interests of our members of staff. I'd recommend you take a look at the research interests of members of staff, because that shapes what they teach in the 4th year. As I've said before, you would do 3 modules from a list like this, and then you would do your dissertation. So the 4th year, you get a lot of choice. In the 4th year, students, as I've said, enjoy their dissertations enormously. It's always a challenge. Often there are tiers, because doing research is a complicated process. Getting people to take part in your research, being able to analyze the data, it's a complicated task. So yeah, it's not without tears, but it is tremendously rewarding. And each year we take our students to a conference organised by the Scottish branch of the BPS. Sometimes it's in Aberdeen, sometimes it's in Edinburgh, sometimes it's in Glasgow, sometimes it's in Dundee. And the students there will give a talk to the conference. The conference will be made up of students from across Scotland, all studying psychology, most of them in their 4th year, some in their 3rd year. And the audience can be quite large, and the students give their talks, and essentially you get 15 minutes for your talk, 10 minutes for the talk, and 5 minutes for questions. So on the way to this event, we go by coach. The bus is quiet as everybody is going through their slides, making sure they've got the story right. On the way back, of course, it is full of noise, because people are really very, very happy to have not only survived the day, but to have done very, very well. And each year our students win prizes. There are various competitions, and one year we had 4 students who won very high prestige prizes. So it's a very attractive event, and it's always good to see our students doing so well. Students who are interested can, if they want to, ask members of staff to work alongside them. So each member of staff will have various research projects that are underway, and you could ask if you could help with that project. It's an internship in the sense that you don't get paid, but you do get experience working in that area with that member of staff. So it is an opportunity to build up your experience in an area that you perhaps wouldn't otherwise develop any expertise in. You get to help with a project that's ongoing. You perhaps learn a new research method, and that can be a very good way of augmenting the skills that you pick up through the formal teaching. So I'd recommend that certainly. In terms of what you can do with a psychology degree, well, the options are very wide and broad. For many psychology career destinations, you're going to need to have further training. So if you want to be an educational psychologist, you will need to do an educational psychology course. Forensic psychology, health psychology, occupational psychology, organizational, sport and exercise, clinical, all of these would typically require further training. To be a clinical psychologist, that is incredibly competitive and typically requires a clinical doctorate. So you're looking at a 3-year doctoral degree to be a clinical psychologist. Sport and exercise psychology, that's something that's grown enormously in popularity over the years, looking at how psychology can be used to improve performance. Occupational and organizational psychology, I think the names speak for themselves. We spend a lot of our time in organizations, a lot of our time at work, making sure you're in the right occupation, thinking, is this the right organization? How can we improve this organization so that it really is a pleasant place to be, a place where individuals can thrive? That's where psychology can speak. Health psychology, we're trying to think, how can we change people's behavior so that we're less likely to eat that packet of crisps, to guzzle a litre of Coke or something like that? How can you actually change the everyday behaviors that can impact your physical health and also, of course, your mental health? Forensic psychology, thinking about how psychology can be used in relation to criminality and assessing and treating criminal behaviour. Educational psychology, again, I think the name speaks for itself, supporting children in educational settings. So those are the sorts of careers that often people have in mind when they think of doing a psychology degree. And for sure, a first degree in psychology is key to that. Having a BPS recognised degree is absolutely crucial, but these careers typically require further degree training. Many of our students go down that route. However, we also have many who go into other non-psychology fields. So students going into marketing, recruitment, human resources, management of any type in any organisation. The skills that you get really are skills that employers want. Most graduate level jobs involve individuals looking at data, reviewing data, making recommendations, making decisions. If you think about somebody working for the local government, they're perhaps having to manage a budget, several £1 million, and they're needing to think how best to spend that money. Well, what are the outcomes that we get if we spend the money on this or if we spend the money on that? So being able to make those judgments requires the research skills that we teach. We teach those skills that allow you to reflect upon complex patterns of data and draw inferences. We have students going into teaching and education, research, many go into research, counselling, and so on. So there's many, many areas where our students go. And that really is because of the transferable skills. This transferable skills, problem solving, critical analytical thinking, data analysis, statistics, being able to present and communicate results. That really is one of the core skills that you get through doing a degree in psychology. So I've said a little bit about psychology. I should say a little bit about the University of Dundee. This is a picture of the Scrimgeour building, and the psychology department is located within this building. As you go through the doors there, if you turn left, you would go into law. If you turn right, you would go into psychology. And here we have some fantastic facilities. We have our offices, and it's a great place. It's a great building. We have facilities for students. We have a wonderful room that students can use for their own private study. It's a wood panelled room, very attractive. We have various laboratories associated with our research, and we have various teaching rooms. So students should be able to get the skills that they need for their degree. The university as a whole is ranked highly. I don't think I need to say too much about this. In all of the recent rankings of universities, Dundee typically does very well. So I've spoken quite a lot, and hopefully there's a few questions that we can now take a look at. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and hopefully I can see if there are some questions. And I can see that some questions have been published here. And there's a good number of questions here. So let's go through some of these questions and I can hopefully answer some of them. Do you need to have other classes or can you just do psychology? Good question. You have to do psychology. Sorry, you have to do other classes. So the first 2 years you do psychology for 1/3 of your time. There's a range of other subjects and students sometimes think, oh, why do I have to do these other subjects? But actually that breadth is really important because with psychology we are talking about human behavior and you need to have a breadth of perspective to understand the complexity of human behavior. So pretty well anything that you study will be relevant to psychology in some way. So the answer to your question is yes, you do have to do those other classes in the first 2 years. And I think it's a great plus. Are joint degrees accredited? Excellent question. They are in certain conditions, and the conditions are a wee bit complicated, but essentially what you need to do is to have done the courses that we teach in the 3rd year. You would do those courses over your 3rd and your 4th year, and you would need to do a dissertation. So essentially you can do a joint degree that is accredited. That means you're doing the modules that we teach in the 3rd year. You can take them in your 3rd year and in your 4th year, and you do a dissertation. Then your degree would be accredited by the BPS. Is psychology hard or is it subjectively hard? Well, that's a good question. Is psychology hard? I think studying any degree level subject is hard. I think that some people may think, oh, psychology is a bit wishy-washy. It's not. At the core of psychology is the need to be able to investigate your claims. So I may have a particular claim that I make. Are you going to believe it just because Nick Hopkins says it? I hope not. I hope you'd say, well, he says that. What's the basis for his claim? Let's see what research he has done. Let's see who he did that research with. Let's see the methods that he adopted. Let's see how he has analysed that. Has he really drawn inferences that are defensible? Now, that is a critical skill that I think you need to be a good psychologist. Those skills can be quite hard initially to learn, but I don't think it's intrinsically hard. So I think all degrees are equally hard, and psychology is perhaps hard in particular ways. It requires you to be a critical thinker, a critical consumer of research. So hopefully that's gone some way to addressing that question. Do I need to do 7 years of schooling to become a clinical psychologist? Now, when you say schooling, I'm guessing you're not meaning schooling at school. You're talking about 7 years of study. Do I need to do 7 years of university study to become a clinical psychologist? In the UK, typically, yes. You will need to have an undergraduate degree. That could be a 3-year degree or it could be a 4-year degree, and then you would do a clinical doctorate. But normally, to be a clinical psychologist, you would have done something else in addition to that. Getting onto a clinical psychology clinical doctorate course is amazingly competitive. So very often students do their first degree, either 3 or 4 years, and then they would work as an assistant to a psychologist, and they would get a job and perhaps do that for a year or maybe 2 years. That gives them some experience that then makes it easier for them to apply to to join a clinical doctorate program. So the path to becoming a clinical psychologist is long for sure, and it's a very competitive route. So I go to uni for 4 years, then register with the BPS. Essentially, you would have your degree, you would study for 4 years. You would also need to get a 2-2 or above. So you have to get a certain level of performance. So not just a degree, it has to be a 2-2 or above. And then you would be eligible for graduate, you would have eligibility for joining the BPS. What makes your psychology course different from psychology at other universities? Good question. I think this is where the research interest of the members of staff is really important. Some universities will have members of staff who are all very interested in one or two areas. And if that's the area that you're interested in, then that's great. But if that area of research isn't what really excites you, then that's going to be a bit of a limitation. So undoubtedly, the British Psychological Society requirement is that we cover a broad curriculum. We do that in our third year. What we do in our fourth year reflects very much our research interests. And Dundee is good in that we have members of staff with research interests across the board in social psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, biological psychology. We've got that breadth. We don't have people interested in organizational psychology or occupational psychology. So if you're really interested in those areas, then frankly, another university would be a better option for you. So we have a good breadth, which is important. I'd also say that we are a relatively small department, about 17, 18 members of staff. We're quite youthful. You wouldn't think that by looking at me. I'm 62 and I'm the oldest by a long stretch. Most of my colleagues will be in their 30s or 40s. So it's quite youthful. Because we are fairly small, we are friendly. We don't have a massive number of students. That means we can get to know our students quite a lot more, I think, than some universities that have literally hundreds of first-year students. So I think what makes us different is that we are small, and that brings a degree of friendliness and informality. You can knock on people's office and they'll be very happy to see you. We try to make that really a big part of our ethos. I think we have the breadth of topics to cover many people's interests. Are we graded on the other subjects we take alongside psychology? Absolutely, yes, you are. So for each of your courses, you need to pass the course to progress. So you are graded. That can be based upon coursework, it can be based on exams, various different elements according to which subject. So it's important that you do well in psychology, but it's also important that you pass your other subjects so that you can transition into the second year and then into the third year. If you fail a course, it's not the end of the world at all. So students do fail modules, and then there are opportunities to resit the module. And sometimes students may need to redo a year. So certainly people have all sorts of things that affect their progress. It could be their own health, it could be the health of families, it could be parental divorce, all manner of things go on and impact people's lives. So it is possible for sure to redo modules or to redo a year. Okay, right now I'm 16, I'm going to uni next year. Well, I'm 17, basically 18. I could become a clinical psychologist by the time I'm 25. I think that would be pushing it, because you would need to have some experience, I think, and when they're evaluating you to take you on board to be a clinical psychologist, one of the concerns they would have, I think, is about one's life experiences. To become a clinical psychologist, I think probably they would want people who've had quite a lot of experience. So I think it'd be pushing it at 25, 28 maybe, 27 maybe. I think it takes a little bit of time. I could be wrong, but I think 25 is a bit too fast. Are there any chances to do work experience within the course? Now, that's a very good question. So not directly, and as you can imagine, it would be a very dangerous thing to do, to put somebody, a student, in a position where they are working with somebody that could impact upon that person's progression. So if you think of people who are having experiences of poor mental health, Just because you're a psychology student doesn't necessarily mean that you would be a suitable person to work with somebody like that. So we don't have those formal arrangements. What we do have is a lot of students do voluntary work. So this is something that they would do in their own time. So it's not within the course, but a lot of students do this. And it is a really useful thing to do, because if you want to go on to be a clinical psychologist, which is incredibly competitive, the first question they will ask you is, well, what experience do you have? And if you simply say, oh, I've done my degree in psychology, that's not really going to do it. If you say, well, I did my degree in psychology, and while doing that, I work for an organisation that offers support to people who have brain injury, or while doing my degree, I also did something that was involved in helping children who were underprivileged, or blah, blah, blah. So I think opportunities to do work within the course, it's very hard for us to formally arrange that. However, the opportunity is for students to do voluntary work. Of course, that's in their own time and it's without pay. So, any more questions? Okay, do I need to pass Nat 5 maths at grade C to get accepted? Because I've got grade D, but all my other subjects are decent. No, I think I would need to check this. Information should be on our website about specific school qualifications. I don't think we ask specifically for maths. I don't think we do. That may have changed. I used to do admissions many years ago, and we didn't have a specific requirement for maths. So Warren, your best bet would be to look at the website for psychology. Does it specify any school subjects? I doubt if it does. Oh, Joe's replying. Let's see what Joe's got to say. Oh, we can't see. What would you suggest to take as your other subject to help with the psychology? I think it's got to be something that you enjoy. I think, you know, the important thing about your first couple of years at Dundee is to really enjoy your time, to be exposed to a breadth of subjects. I think it's a good idea perhaps to do a subject that you've never done before. People often think, oh, I've done history and geography at school, I'd like to, I'll do history and geography. Well, that's fine if you really enjoyed those subjects, but I think there's also something to be said for being a bit adventurous and trying something new. So it's an opportunity, and you may discover certain skills or discover certain interests that otherwise you'd never have. So I think we should really look on those first 2 years as an opportunity to experiment. And if you decide, oh, actually, I don't really like this subject, it's possible to change. You've not signed up for life, so you've got an opportunity to change. Chances to study abroad, yes. Quite a few of our students would go to English-speaking countries. So very often that is to North America, Canada, or the US. Would you have psychology every day? No, you wouldn't. You would not have psychology every day. You'd probably have psychology in your first year about 3 days out of 5, I'm guessing. How heavy is the mathematical aspect of the psychology course? Well, actually, there's very little maths, I have to say. What you instead would do would be handling data using various computer packages. Now, of course, those computer packages are running various programs and algorithms that are implementing the statistics, but you don't need to sit there with a calculator doing all of this. Now, when I did my degree, we did have to sit there with a calculator doing all of those things. Now, that is really not part of the equation. You have to be, I guess, reasonably open to learning about how to use computer packages. And some people do find numbers just per se a little bit frightening. I certainly did when I started my degree, but we make no assumptions about people's background. And the important thing is that we're learning statistics to help us be better psychologists. We're not here to be mathematicians, and we're not going to be very good mathematicians. What we need to do is have a broad understanding of how to interpret data, what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. And that is something really that you can pick up without having any great mathematical expertise. I certainly wouldn't claim to have any mathematical expertise, but somehow I've managed to survive this long. Okay, oh, a few more questions. What have we got here? Blah, blah, blah. If you study abroad, do you miss year 4? No, if you were to go abroad, that would typically be in your second year. We want you here for the 3rd year and the 4th year, because the degree that you get is based upon what you do in year 3 and year 4. And we want to have complete control over the way in which you're evaluated so that we can really be clear about the quality of what you have done. So your degree will be based upon your year 3 and year 4 work, and you'd be here in Dundee for that. If you go abroad, it would be in your 2nd year. Okay. Any last questions? We've had a lot of questions. It's been very good. I think probably we've had our fill of questions. So I'll just say thank you very much for joining today. Thanks very much for all of the questions. And I hope that's been helpful in some way. If not, please get in contact. And I wish you all the best in terms of making your decision about what to study and also where to study. So thanks very much for coming today and all the best. Bye-bye.